mean, the logical problem advocates that advocates of the logical problem of evil argue that evil makes the existence of God impossible through logic and thought experiments. They argue that since God created the universe out of nothing, it was well within his power to create a universe.
Just click cancel, it'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay. It was well within his power to create a universe free of evil and suffering. Since he is omniscient, God is aware of the suffering that occurs on a day-to-day basis on earth. Mackey argues that if God is all-loving, he would wish to stop the evil happening on his creation. He states that any wholly good being eliminates evil as fast as it can, and that since God is supposedly omnipotent, he could immediately and effortlessly carry out the desire and end all suffering instantly. Mackey says that an all-loving God would not only have the desire to aid those that are suffering, but to eradicate evil and suffering altogether. Epicurus, that's the one. Inconsistent triad. It stipulates that if the God of classical theism exists, he must by definition have two key traits, obviously omnipotence and benevolence. However, if he was both these things, he would be able to stop and be motivated to stop suffering happening on earth. The fact that despite God having these characteristics, evil still exists on earth. It is logically inconsistent that God could exist. Therefore, Epicurus argues that the God of classical theism cannot logically exist alongside evil. Hume proposes another possibility in which God might not be omnibenevolent, may not be omnipotent, or that evil may not exist, since it's almost impossible to argue that evil and suffering do not exist on earth. It must be accepted that God is either omnipotent, impotent, or malicious. Hume says that by conceding one corner of Epicurus' triad, we must accept that the God of classical theism cannot exist, concluding that the triad entails the death of the God of classical theism. Aquinas. Although Hume is supported by ideas of Aquinas' writings, which say that if God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But since there is undeniable evil in the world, Aquinas concludes God does not exist. Aquinas' writings agree with Hume in saying that the existence of God would result in infinite goodness on earth. Even if the tiniest bit of evil existed, which it does, then the existence of God would be impossible, as the two polar opposites would totally contradict one another. However, Aquinas himself rejected this theodicy, saying that the logical argument he had put forward relied on two premises. The concept of infinite goodness is part of the definition of God. The goodness that we perceive is the same as that which God perceives. If, like Aquinas, you do not accept one or both of the premises, the argument does not logically disprove the existence of God.
Can I just chip in just very quickly, just to make it clear that it's the second premise that Aquinas disagrees with. So Aquinas says that the goodness we perceive isn't the same as God.
Okay.
So what Aquinas is saying is that his theodicy, if you like, is that what God sees as good is not what we see as good, and so what we see as evil isn't what God sees as evil either. And that's his theodicy. So Aquinas doesn't reject a theodicy, he rejects the inconsistent triad. All right, thanks very much.
The evidential problem of evil is a problem arguing that the amount of suffering in the world makes it improbable that the God of classical theism exists. This is due to the amount of unnecessary suffering that occurs on a daily basis. Now, this argument is based on probability, not certainty, therefore it does not try to completely disprove the existence of God of classical theism, as opposed and it claims that the amount of evil in the world shows that the existence of a deity is unlikely. William Rowe created this argument on 3 premises. The first premise is that there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil that was equally bad or worse. Second premise is that an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good and permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient and wholly good being. And I use 2 examples to show this. The first is the idea that a 5-year-old girl is raped, beaten and murdered by her stepdad when he is in a drunken fit of rage. Rowe accepts the idea that her death may be necessary as a consequence of human sin. However, Rowe's argument is based that if death is a necessary evil, why is her raising suffering a necessary evil as well? And he argues that it isn't. The second example, which is not completely related to human suffering, but it's the idea that a deer is being chased by a lion in a deserted woodland, or something along those lines, and that the lion could catch and fatally wound this deer, and then the deer would die a slow, painful death as a result of its injuries, and the lion would leave it. And the argument is that in this situation, there is no chance a person will ever become aware of the deer's death, suffering, or its prior existence. Therefore, what good is there to come from the wounding of the deer? And since this situation has no positive outcomes for anybody involved, how can this be categorised as a necessary evil?